Well, it's good to see you guys this morning. My name is Kent. If I hadn't had the chance to meet you, if you got a Bible, turn with me to Philippians chapter 2, that passage we just read. Philippians chapter 2. When I was a kid, there was one particular phrase that I did not care for, didn't like to hear, absolutely hated it when my parents would say it. It was the phrase, "because I said so." Anybody else not a fan of that one? Yeah. Did not love that phrase. I just felt like it lacked a certain creativity, thoughtfulness, understanding, intentionality. It just felt like it wasn't what I wanted in those particular moments when my parents would say that. It felt like there should have been more to it, you know? It was just like, because I said so, Mom and Dad, that's all I get in this particular situation. Now, it's funny that I hated that phrase so much as a kid, because now that I'm a parent, I love that phrase. Like, I use that phrase so much with my 8 and 5-year-old. The words "because I said so" just tend to roll effortlessly off of my lips at nearly every moment. So after the 5th time that I've asked my kids to do something, after the 5th explanation, after the 5th why question that follows that explanation, eventually I just say, "because I said so, that's why. Because I'm your dad, because I need you to obey, or simply because I can't talk about this anymore without losing my mind." Sometimes that's the reason that is given. But still, I think there's something in us, really both as children and adults, that is just averse to doing something just because someone told us to do it, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter whether it's a parent saying that, or a boss or a supervisor at work saying that, or a professor saying that, a government saying that. Shout out to my libertarian friends in the room, right? It doesn't really matter who's saying "because I said so." We simply do not like being told to obey or conform simply because someone said so. That's our tendency. Now, here's where that gets interesting for us as followers of Jesus. On the one hand, there are absolutely times in the scriptures where God tells us to do something simply because he said so. There are times where God says, "because I am God and because you are not God, you should do the thing that I asked you to do." Times where God says, "my ways are higher than your ways. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. And because of all of that, I'm going to ask you to trust me when I tell you to do something that you don't want to do, or not to do something that you do want to do." But then there are other times in the scriptures, and I would argue that today's passage in Philippians is actually one of them, where we're actually given the reasons why God tells us to do and not do certain things. In other words, times where he doesn't just tell us that we should obey, he actually gives us logical, rational reasons for why we should obey, or at least tangible motivations for doing so. And I would argue they're really good reasons. We don't always get this type of explanation in the scriptures, but when we do, I think it's really important that we take notice of it. Does that make sense? So with that context, here's how we're going to frame up today's passage in the book of Philippians chapter 2. First, Paul, the author of Philippians, is going to tell us what God wants his people to do. Second, he's going to tell us how he wants us to do it. And then he's going to give us 3 specific reasons why we should do it. So what, how, and then 3 reasons why. So first, let's take a look at what we are to do as God's people. Pick it up with me in Philippians 2, starting in verse 12. Paul says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed," so there's our idea, obedience, "as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence when I'm there with you, but now much more in my absence, when I'm not there with you in person. Continue," Paul says, "to work out your salvation with fear and trembling." So it would seem that a synonym for obeying is what Paul calls working out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, we're going to get to the fear and trembling portion here in a moment, because I know that reads odd to some of us. But first, let's talk about this idea of working out our salvation. chances are that phrase reads a little bit funny to many of us too, if for no other reason, because many of us who grew up in church have been taught to think about salvation as more of a past event, right? I would guess that probably 9 times out of 10, when a Christian in America talks about their salvation, when they use that word, they are talking about the moment that they first became a follower of Jesus. And more than that, we tend to think about salvation as a past event that happens to us, right? Not one that we participate in or work out ourselves. So, what exactly is Paul talking about here when he says to work out our salvation? Well, first, I think we need to understand that for Paul, salvation was not just something that happened in the past. For him, salvation was past, present, and future. Followers of Jesus have been saved, past tense, are being saved, present tense, and one day will be saved, future tense. Here's how theologians have sort of teased that out and elaborated on it. When we first believe in Jesus, the moment we believe in Jesus, we are saved from the penalty of sin, past tense. As we follow Jesus, we are being saved practically from the power of sin, present tense. And one day in the future, we will be saved, we will be rescued from even the presence and existence of sin entirely, future tense. So salvation, at least true biblical salvation, according to Paul, is a lifelong experience for followers of Jesus, which helps explain why, from Paul's perspective, a follower of Jesus can and should work out their salvation. In fact, I would argue that part of the reason we have so many self-proclaimed Christians in America that don't look very much like Jesus is because we have quite a few people who are only interested in the past tense version of salvation and not at all interested in the present or future version of it. We have people who are perfectly content to be saved from the penalty of sin, but aren't at all interested in being saved from the power or presence of sin. But that's probably a teaching for a different day. Our point for today is just to say that salvation is absolutely something that God does. We're going to get to that here in a moment. But it's also something that we participate in and respond to in tangible sorts of ways as God's people. This is especially true with the present tense portion of salvation. So when I confess my sins and shortcomings to God and to other followers of Jesus in my life, that is me working out my salvation. When I set up barriers and safeguards on my phone that help prevent me from watching things that I shouldn't watch and looking at things I shouldn't look at, that is me working out my salvation. When we as a community take tangible steps to reconcile broken relationships, to offer forgiveness to people who wrong us, and to apologize to people that we have wronged, that's us collectively working out our salvation. And the list goes on, right? I could give you countless examples, but those are all ways that we tangibly work out the salvation that has been granted to us by God. God has made all of those things possible, but I participate in working them out as a response, as a follower of Jesus. And then Paul says that we should do all of that with fear and trembling. That's how we should go about it. I think the reason this portion, fear and trembling, the reason this portion of the passage is tough for many of us is because as modern people, we spend a lot of time talking about how God is our friend and God is our helper, how God is with us and among us and for us and available to us, how he's gracious and compassionate towards us. And according to the scriptures, every single one of the things I just mentioned are true. Beautifully true. And at the very same time, God is also greater than us. God is higher than us. As we mentioned earlier, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways. He is with us and alongside us and for us for sure. And he is to be worshiped and revered and honored for who he is. That's why we gather here on Sundays and we sing songs of worship to God, the Creator. It's because He is our friend, but He's not just our friend, He's also our Lord. He's greater than us. So I think this is one of those tensions that we are called to walk in as followers of Jesus on a regular basis. We're called to understand that God's holiness does not make Him less loving, but also His love doesn't make Him less holy. When Paul says that we are to relate to God and to our salvation with fear and trembling, he doesn't mean that we aren't to see God as loving or gracious or compassionate. He doesn't mean that we are to live in constant terror of God smiting us suddenly or unexpectedly, but he does mean that we should not take lightly who God is or what He's made possible for us. We are to understand that God hasn't saved us so that we can do whatever we want, but rather He saved us so that we can do whatever He wants, which ultimately is what's best for us and for the world. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. And then Paul offers one final clarification on all of this. Verse 13. He says, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill His good purpose." So wait, Paul, which one is it? Are we to work out our salvation, or does God work in us? Paul's answer to that question is yes. Exactly. So in the original language, the word work out in verse 12 means to work something down to the proper endpoint, to a conclusion. It means to accomplish or to complete a task. That's what we are to do. But the word here for God working in us is the Greek word energeo, which is where we get the English word energy. So Paul is saying that we work with the energy that God provides. We work, God makes it possible for us to work. So this is the Christian life. Not that no effort is required, but that no effort is required that God has not already given us the energy and ability to do. So I was trying to think of like a word picture that would help with this. And what I thought of was when I was in college, my dad would pay the rent for the apartment that I lived in, but he really wanted me to learn the practice of writing a check for rent. This was back in the day when you had to write like a paper check. No Venmo existed back then. But he wanted me to get in the habit of actually writing the check and paying my rent. So what he would do every single month is that he would deposit the money for rent into my bank account, and then I would have to go to the office where I paid my rent and actually write the check for my rent. Now, question, even though my dad gave me the money, did I still have to pay the rent? Yeah, and if I didn't, in fact, now I was at odds with the apartment complex because I didn't pay the rent, and I was at odds with my dad because my dad would be like, hey, I put money in your bank account, where did that money go, right? I think that is actually a picture of what Paul's trying to say here. So God has given us the energy to work out our salvation. But that doesn't mean that we do nothing. It means that we operate in the energy and the power that God supplies. That's what it means to follow Jesus. So all of that really is the what of this passage. We are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, using the energy and ability that God provides. Now, I want us to look at the how. How exactly should we go about obeying? Verse 14. Do everything. It's interesting. That word in the Greek means everything. Like all the things that there are. Do everything, Paul says, without grumbling or arguing. Do everything without grumbling or arguing. I don't know about you. I have met more than a few Christians in my life who seem to do many of the things that we are supposed to do as God's people, but man, are they grumpy about it. Anybody met those people? We didn't have a lot of them here in the South, I think. Like with these people, if you observed their life, it would be hard to nail down many things in their life that are blatantly inconsistent with the Scriptures. They're doing the stuff that you're supposed to do as a follower of Jesus. But at the same time, it's like they are constantly angry and bitter and resentful that they have to live in that way. Like when you witness their general emotional demeanor towards their life, it almost makes you want to ask them, do you like following Jesus? Do you like living this way? Because it doesn't seem like you do from just everything about you, right? But let's go ahead and be honest about it. That posture is not just out there. Oftentimes it's in here, right? So I can't tell you how many times, personally, I have loaded my family up in the car to go spend time with my life group and just been very grumpy about the fact that I'm going to do that. Maybe it had been a hard week or a hard day or the kids are being crazy. Maybe it was just that I was tired and I would have rather stayed home and watched my favorite Netflix show, right? Life group was just not what I wanted to do that night. So I'm grumpy the whole way there. I can't tell you how many times I have gotten ready to send money, to give money to somebody in my life because they're in need. And I've been so grumpy about all the things that means I won't be able to buy for myself as a result of giving them money. I think if a lot of us were just entirely honest about it, we would admit that we often grumble and argue when we obey. In fact, let me give you lenses for something. If you find yourself constantly discontent about the way your life group does life together, there's a chance that it's not actually a problem with them, it's a problem with you. There's a chance that what is happening is you are constantly grumbling and complaining because you don't like the fact that you have to obey and be around those people that are sometimes difficult to love. That's what Paul is trying to get ahead of here. That's what he's trying to caution us against. And what's interesting is that Paul's language in this portion of Philippians is actually a direct reference to the story of the Exodus in the Old Testament. So after God rescued the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, he led them through the wilderness on the way to the Promised Land. But as they did that, the Israelites became notorious for grumbling and complaining and arguing about their situation to each other and sometimes to God himself. They were constantly irritable, constantly grumpy, constantly complaining about nearly every single part of their situation in the wilderness. At one point, even saying that they wish God would have left them back in Egypt in slavery instead of rescuing them out. That's how grumpy they were about it. So in context, Paul is saying to the Philippian church here, you guys, just like the Israelites, have been rescued out of a terrible situation and given new life. Just like the Israelites, you guys are being rescued out of your situation. And just like the Israelites, you will eventually be brought into a much better situation. But your grumbling and complaining seems to reveal that, one, you don't realize how terrible your situation was, and two, you don't realize how incredible your rescue out of it was and is. Otherwise, you'd be doing what you are doing without grumbling and complaining. That's Paul's point here. So I would just ask us in turn, how do we go about obeying? Like on a regular basis, as a default. Do we do it with joy? With an understanding of just how incredible God's grace to us has been? Or do we do it while regularly grumbling and complaining about why we have to obey? The way that we obey as followers of Jesus tells us a lot about what we think obedience is and who it is that we believe we're obeying. And I just add, part of the reason that Paul brings up grumbling and arguing in this particular passage, in this particular letter, is probably because those things are the polar opposite of joy, right? We've been saying throughout the series that in the scriptures, joy is this ability to celebrate good things wherever they exist. It's the ability to seek out and recognize and rejoice in good things in our life, even when they might be few and far between, even when they might be difficult to spot. And if that's what joy is, grumbling and complaining is precisely the opposite of joy. It's the opposite posture. It's seeking out bad things to gripe about wherever they exist. It's looking at your incredible rescue from Jesus, what he's done for you, what he's brought you out of, and then responding with, now what can I find around here to complain about? Paul realizes that nothing will empty a person's life of joy faster than a constant tendency to grumble and complain. And doing that over time, over the course of months or years in your life, will often convince you that nothing in your life is worth celebrating at all. Paul says, do everything without grumbling and complaining and arguing. So to summarize, the what in this passage is that we should obey, working out our salvation with fear and trembling. The how is that we should do all of that without constant grumbling and complaining. Now, let's get to what we alluded to in the beginning, which is the why. Why exactly should God's people obey, and why should they do it without grumbling and arguing? What's our motivation for living this way? What's our motivations for obedience exactly? Well, like I said earlier, I would argue that Paul gives us 3 reasons in the rest of this passage. We'll take each one in turn, we'll note where they are in the passage and talk a bit about them. First, we obey for God. We obey for God. So first and arguably foremost in our life, we obey for God. Look with me at the first half of verse 15. So that, Paul says, obey so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a warped and crooked generation. Additionally, back in verse 13, Paul said that God works in us to fulfill God's good purpose. So our obedience is first Godward in direction, in its orientation. We obey because we want to please God. Now, I would argue this is another one of those tensions that we're called to walk in as followers of Jesus, because on one level, if we follow Jesus, we believe that we already have the unconditional approval of God the Father through Jesus. That's already been established on our behalf through Jesus' work on the cross. But at the same time, and you could argue in response to that reality, we also live to please God. Plenty of places in the New Testament that talk about it that way. We also live to please God. We also now have this desire to live in a way that honors God, blesses God, makes him smile as a result. And we don't do that because we're lacking his approval. We do that as a response to already having it. So think about it like this. My son Whit is on a flag football team right now. He has now caught 2 touchdown passes in 3 games, which I'm beginning to think is going to his head, so don't mention it to him. Certainly don't mention that I talked about it in a sermon. That would be extra bad. But I wasn't there for the last game when he caught a touchdown pass. And so when I got home that day, he could not wait to tell me that he caught another touchdown pass. Like I walked in the door, I didn't even have time to shut the door behind me, and he was like, "Dad, guess what?" And he told me immediately that he caught a touchdown pass. Now, you could look at him doing that in one of 2 ways, right? One would be you could assume that my son is constantly operating at a deficit of approval from me, and he thought this touchdown pass is what would finally do it, right? Like he thought if I knew he caught another touchdown pass, I would finally approve of him as my son. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's the dynamic happening in our household. There are probably some dads that operate that way with their sons. Some of them, judging by appearance, are in our flag football league. But hopefully they never listen to this podcast. But I don't think that is the dynamic between me and my son. I think what's happening in that interaction with my son is that Whit knows he already has my approval. And he knew that if he told me about the touchdown pass, he would find joy in my joy over him. He'd hear me say, "Nice, dude," and we'd do our ridiculous secret handshake that we made up a while back, right? He would find joy in my joy over him. In other words, he was not doing that out of a place of having a lack of approval from me. He was doing that from a place of already having it. I think that is a picture of how obedience should work in the life of a follower of Jesus. We don't obey in order to secure God's approval of us. We obey because we already have God's approval. We're secure in it, and therefore we want to have joy in his joy over us. We want to make him smile, not because we need his smile or are lacking it, but because we already have it through Jesus. Does that make sense? We obey for God, to please God. Second reason we obey, according to this passage, second reason for obedience is for the world, for the sake of the world. The second reason that Paul gives us for obeying is so that we can demonstrate to the world who Jesus is and what life with him is like as a result of obeying. So look back with me in the second half of verse 15. Paul says, "Then, as in when you obey, you will shine among them." In context, he's talking about the outside world there, people that don't follow Jesus. "You will shine among them," the world, "like stars in the sky as you hold firmly to the word of life." Paul says that when we obey, over time, we begin to stand out from the world around us in a really good, refreshing sort of way, like stars against the night sky. By way of contrast, I'm not going to spend a ton of time unpacking this because Colton actually talked about it at length 2 weeks ago in his teaching. But the idea is that when we live the way that the scriptures teach us to live, a contrast starts to develop between us and those that don't follow Jesus. It becomes more and more evident, for example, that we think about our money differently from the world around us. We think about our sexuality and sexual expression differently from the world around us. We think about our time and our energy differently from the world around us. We think about our relationships differently, our homes and our stuff and our possessions differently from the world around us. All of those things actually serve over time as a refreshing sort of contrast to the world around us. I love the way that Tim Keller put this. If you've been through our City Church class here, you've likely heard this quote before. He says it this way. He says, "The early church was strikingly different." Notice that language, strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. So here's an example. The pagan society, those that didn't follow Jesus, they were stingy with their money and promiscuous with their bodies. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. But the Christians came along and gave practically nobody their body, and they gave practically everybody their money. It's a contrast. The early church stood out by way of contrast with the world around them, like stars against a night sky. And just like stars in the night sky, this type of obedience brought light to a dark situation. It brought hope to a society where there was not a lot of hope to go around at the time. So we obey as God's people, at least in some sense, for the sake of the world around us. And the intention is that as we do that in more and more ways as God's people, it will raise questions from those around us who notice it. People will wonder why we live in such a different sort of way, and that creates this perfect opportunity to tell them about the word of life, in Paul's words. The message of the gospel that inspires that type of obedience in us. This is what it means to live your life, as we say around here, on mission with Jesus. It means you obey for the sake of the world around you. Does that make sense? Okay. Third and final reason we obey from this passage is that we obey for each other. For each other. In other words, for other followers of Jesus, we live life with. I get that from the second half of verse 16 through the end of 18. It says this. Paul says, and then, meaning when you obey and when that obedience makes you shine like stars in the sky, Paul says, then I, Paul, will be able to boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me, Paul says. So Paul is saying that him witnessing the Philippians' obedience, him seeing the Philippians obey, actually brings him tangible encouragement as a result of their obedience. Did you see that in the passage? He said that as an outcome of them heeding these instructions, as a result of them obeying Jesus, he, Paul, will be able to boast. He will get to know that he did not labor in vain when he helped start that church and when he continued to contribute to their discipleship to Jesus. For Paul, there is this tangible joy in his spirit in witnessing the faithful obedience of other followers of Jesus, especially followers of Jesus that he helped contribute to in meaningful ways. For those of you that have spent a substantial amount of time in your life discipling other followers of Jesus, you know the type of joy that Paul is talking about here. The joy of getting to witness somebody else follow Jesus faithfully, that you help them learn how to do that. And I would remind you that, according to the rest of this letter to the Philippians, Paul also believes that his obedience in the midst of his own suffering can bring the Philippians joy as a result. So this is a consistent theme in the scriptures that obedience in our lives as followers of Jesus actually benefits other followers of Jesus as a direct result. So when I witness people in my life group putting in the effort to follow Jesus well, it encourages me to follow Jesus well. When other guys in my life group are open and honest about their sin, it makes me want to be open and honest about my sin. When I witness other people in our church being radically generous with their money, it makes me want to be radically generous as well and complain and grumble a little bit less about it as a result. When I witness other people in our church being intentional with their friends and neighbors and coworkers and classmates that don't know Jesus, it makes me want to be intentional with the non-believers in my life as well. Put another way, obedience is contagious within a community of faith. Our obedience can actually inspire other people to obey. I love the way that Hebrews 10 articulates the same idea. If you've been around our church long, you probably heard us bring this verse up a lot, or these couple verses up a lot. Hebrews 10 puts it this way. It says, let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. In other words, motivate each other to obey. How does that happen? Keep reading, verse 25. By not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing. AKA, you cannot spur one another on towards obedience if you are not physically around each other on a regular basis. But by encouraging one another, Hebrews says, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So next week, Jordan is going to talk more in detail about the practice of encouragement, because I think it is something that is sorely lacking in the American church. But here's my point for today, and this is something that does not get said enough, especially in hyper-individualistic societies like our own. You need other followers of Jesus to help you follow Jesus. You need other followers of Jesus to help you follow Jesus. If someone has told you that you can watch a church service online and not be around other followers of Jesus the rest of the week, and that's all it means to be a Christian, they have deceived you. That is not what the scriptures teach. It has never been what the scriptures have taught. Following Jesus is too difficult. It is too countercultural. It is too against the grain. It is too nuanced to go it alone. If you go it alone, you will end up discouraged, confused, or worse, you'll just eventually bail on it altogether. If you want to follow Jesus over the long haul, you will need to situate yourself in close proximity to other people following Jesus. You will need their obedience to help encourage your own obedience. And when you do that, you will experience a different level of joy on a regular basis in a way that you would not have otherwise. There is this mutual encouragement, a mutual joy, a mutual celebration that results from witnessing other people live lives of obedience to God. There is a joy in knowing that you are not the only one doing the difficult task of working out your salvation with fear and trembling, but that you are doing it alongside other followers of Jesus who have the same goal that you do. This is one of the many ways that obedience can be a tangible source of joy to followers of Jesus, especially when it is done in the context of community. So according to this passage, there are at least 3 essential reasons that we should obey. We should obey for God, for the world, and for each other. Again, we are not always given specific reasons for obedience, but sometimes we are. And when we are given those reasons and motivations in the scriptures, I think we would do well to consider them deeply. And more than that, I think we are called to use them as a lens and a filter for how we are currently thinking about our own life. Are we considering the very tangible, very practical reasons for our obedience to Jesus? And if so, is that inspiring us to live lives of obedience to him as a result? So today I want to ask you to do something. I'm going to try to make this as practical as possible for you. What I would love for you to do right now is I'd love for you to just think about one area of your life where you tend to struggle the most with obedience. What's the one area of your life where you struggle most to obey? The one part of your life where you just have a really tough time submitting that thing to Jesus. Maybe it's your sexuality, how you think about your identity, sexually speaking, maybe how you approach sex practically in your life. Maybe it's your money, how you spend your money and what you spend it on and how much of your money you spend. Maybe you're good with money, but it's more about your time. You struggle to make any kind of consistent time available in your life to spend time with other followers of Jesus on a regular basis. Maybe it's in relation to forgiveness. There's someone you know in your life that you need to forgive right now and you simply do not want to do it. Could be any number of different things, and I don't want to minimize any of those, but what is that thing for you? What's the thing that you have the hardest time obeying when it comes to Jesus' instructions over your life? Some of you might be thinking, wow, do I have to pick one? Because there's like several. And that's fine. You can be honest about that. But I would guess that for most of us in the room, there's 1 or 2 things that we struggle with more than the rest. So I want you to just take that thing, whatever that thing is right now, and I just want you to hold that in your mind for a moment. And then what I want you to do is run it through the 3 questions that I'm about to ask. These are just straight out of the 3 motivations that we talked about earlier. First, I want you to ask yourself the question in relation to that area of your life, how would obeying in this area please God? In this area of my life, how would me choosing to obey bless God? How would it make him smile? Again, not because I need his approval, but because I already have it. How could me obeying in this area of my life bring God joy as a result? How could I find joy in his joy over me by obeying? Second question I want you to ask is, how would obeying in this area of your life benefit the world? How would obeying benefit the world? In what ways could obeying here help me provide a helpful, refreshing contrast to the world around me? In what ways could it provide a hopeful alternative to the way that the world typically operates in this arena? How could it be a refreshing picture of the gospel to those around me as a result of my obedience? And then third question, how would obeying here benefit other followers of Jesus? In what ways could my obedience in this area of my life help me encourage and spur on other followers of Jesus in my life group, in this church as a whole, those I'm in relationship with? In what ways could my obedience actually benefit and inspire their obedience? In what ways could it encourage them, remind them of what's true and what's worthwhile? I would invite you to consider, not just today, but at all times in your life, those three things, those three questions. Anytime you are struggling to obey, try asking those three questions about whatever it is. And then, after reflecting on those answers, just ask the question, does that at all motivate me to obey as a result? If not, if that doesn't move the needle at all for you, the problem may be a little bit deeper than just that one area of your life, right? But for the rest of us, if we thought about obedience in that way, I wonder if that wouldn't incline us more towards obedience as a result. So we're just going to land here. I want to circle back to that verse that we discussed earlier in this passage. Verse 13, I'll put it up on the screen. It says this, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." So remember, we work with the energy that God supplies. We put forth effort that he has enabled us to put forward. A life of discipleship to Jesus, according to the scriptures, is a joint endeavor between us and God. He makes it possible. He gives us the energy, the ability, and then we put that energy to work in following and obeying him. These two ideas work in tandem with one another. They are not in competition with each other. They work in tandem with one another. If we ever begin to believe in our life of discipleship to Jesus that the whole thing is up to us, we have misunderstood the message of the cross. God saved us. We did not save us. But simultaneously, if we ever start to believe that because God saved us, it doesn't matter how we live and if we obey, we have also misunderstood the message of the cross. The message that says if anyone wants to be my disciple, they should pick up their cross, deny themselves, and follow me. If that's our perspective, we have misunderstood specifically what God saved us for. God did not save us because of our good works, but he absolutely saved us to do good works. That's Ephesians chapter 2. And it's in understanding those two things, that dynamic, that tension, that we learn what it looks like to follow Jesus. So in just a moment, we're going to go to the tables all around this room. We're going to take communion. Communion represents the body and blood of Jesus, which is the very basis of the salvation that we've been granted by God. And that is the salvation that we work out practically in our lives. When we go to the tables around this room every single week, we are proclaiming that something had to happen for us to be in right relationship with God. And it wasn't something we could do on our own, but rather something Jesus did on our behalf. So if you are a follower of Jesus, you're invited to participate in that with us as we celebrate Jesus together this morning. Let me pray for us.